Um, Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important webinar on ESG, a must or a barrier to developing critical minerals projects across Africa. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists and our moderator too, Richard Morgan, part of our advisory board at CMAG. And I believe introductions will be made shortly. As the world accelerates its transition to cleaner energy and sustainable development, Africa's vast mineral resources, such as lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, offer immense opportunities. These critical minerals are essential for batteries, renewable energy technology, and digital infrastructure. However, the path to harnessing these resources is fraught with challenges, from navigating complex regulatory environments, ensuring environmental protection, and addressing social impacts to securing investor confidence. A current example of this is highlighted in this delicate balance in Zimbabwe's immense lithium potential. While the country's lithium deposits could position it as a key player in global supply chains, the success of these projects hinges on robust ESG practices, balancing economic growth with environmental stewardship and community engagement. Today, we'll explore whether ESG considerations are barriers we must overcome or vital tools to unlock Africa's full potential in critical minerals. I look forward to an engaging discussion and thank you once again for joining. Let me hand over to Richard to proceed. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronnie, and morning, everybody. We're in the same time zones. Do we want to introduce everybody else? How do we go? Shall I do the introducing or let them do them? Anyway, sorry, we hadn't fully choreographed that. My background is last 15 years with Anglo American, often covering Africa, and then prior to that with the UK government. I'll do you in order on my screen. Sarah, do you want to give your little profile?
Yep. Hello, everybody. My name's Professor Sarah Gordon. I started out life as an exploration geologist, actually for Anglo American, Richard. So that's where I started life. But more recently, I've very much been working in the world of sustainability and risk management, being CEO and co-founder of Satarla, but also in the world of research as well. So I do lots of work at Imperial College London in partnership with the likes of the University of Witwatersrand and the University of Johannesburg. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Sarah. Next one up on my screen is Laura.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Hall. I'm head of ESG at TechMet. TechMet is a private investment company in critical minerals, and we invest right across the value chain, so from mining, processing, and recycling. And I've got a background of about 15 years in ESG, mainly actually in Sub-Saharan Africa, but I'm back in London now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura. Davidzo, you're back on my screen now.
Thank you. My name is Davidzo Muchawaya. I'm the regional lead for Africa at IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. I'm basically responsible for implementing the IRMA outreach strategy across the continent. That's from Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Senegal, and all the other countries in between. My background is ESG auditing, so I've been doing quite a number of ESG audits before I joined IRMA full-time. Thank you, and glad to meet you, all of you.
Thanks, Davidzo. Cecilia, also IRMA. Perhaps actually you can also explain to those who don't know what IRMA is.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Veronica, for the great introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Cecilia. I'm the Europe regional lead at IRMA, and I also do outreach to civil society and communities. IRMA is a global initiative that defines what responsible mining is. So on one side, you have the standard, that is the most robust and comprehensive definition of responsible mining, from biodiversity to human rights. And then you have an assurance system that looks at, via independent auditing, at assessing how mine sites are doing against all of these criteria. You may be wondering why there are two people at IRMA here today. Well, thank you, first of all, Veronica, for having us, but because we do complement each other quite well. So my background is actually policy. We'll be touching a little bit about policy and ESG standards today, and I look forward to covering that as well.
In fact, now that I've got you there, Cecilia, I might just start. Natasha, well, I'll introduce yourself, and then I'll come back to Cecilia on something that comes out of that very point she was just making. Natasha, please.
Sure. Thank you, Richard, and to Veronica for hosting this. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm Natasha Buchler. I'm head of ESG at Aperio Intelligence. Aperio is a risk consulting firm that conducts due diligence and investigations, typically ahead of a transaction, maybe a market entry or an acquisition or partnership in a new country or market, and also investigates when things go wrong, conducts litigation support, asset tracing, and the like. I focus very much on supply chain due diligence and have been doing extensive work in this space, particularly for renewable energy companies that are wishing to identify if there's been any forced labor, and particularly Uyghur forced labor in their supply chain. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. That also prompts a question, but having said I go back to Cecilia, I'll do that if I may. Cecilia, the concept of ESG policy and whether it's a must or a barrier for Africa, how do you find that balances out in the IRMA situation? And do the results in Africa show that it's entirely possible to do good ESG?
Thanks for the great question, Richard. So I think, if I take a step back on why IRMA was first set up or created, it's because unfortunately, mining laws across the globe are either not strong enough or not implemented well, right? So you have impacts, long-lasting impacts on those that live closest to the mine, but also significant risks to those that buy mined materials when we think about due diligence processes, as Natasha just mentioned. So IRMA started off with the idea that the right to clean water should be the same, whether you're a community in South Africa, in Indonesia, or in Finland, that there shouldn't be a difference as to what that definition is and what good practice should look like for mining companies. I'll let my colleague Davidzo talk about the scale of IRMA in Africa, but what we do know is that it's absolutely possible to implement strong standards regardless of the context. It's a matter of, the stars aligning in some cases. So the willingness of the leadership of the company, the goals of the company, but also the pressure that is put on the company because of their customers, their investors, or them respecting the asks of communities, workers, and civil society. 90%, 90, of mining companies that come to IRMA, they do so because their customers have asked them to, because their customers want to de-risk their supply chains, they want to understand what's going on, and ultimately they want good practices. Nobody wants their gold or their lithium associated with bad practices, basically. And when we look at the companies that are implementing IRMA today, there are over 100. It's an equal split in terms of market cap. 1/3 of companies are small companies. So for example, Sira Resources in Mozambique that has one mining site, they've completed an IRMA audit. Mid-cap, you've got the example of Aramet, a French mining company who's committed all of its sites globally to be assessed against the IRMA standard. And then large cap, you've got Sibanye, Vale, you've got Anglo, of course, along with others that have either implemented or in the process of completing an audit right now. So it is possible, regardless of the geography and the value, it's definitely there to implement good practices, basically.
That's a really helpfully explained answer. Thank you. How does it feel? I want to switch straight to Laura, I suspect now. Actually, I will come to you, Davidzo and Natasha. But Laura, I don't know how you describe TechMet, but you're probably in the middle of that somewhere. How does it feel? I know you've not been an IRMA sort of fully engaged person, but in terms of standards and how TechMet gets around to implementing them, how does that feel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is that, we absolutely need standards, and the idea of sort of what good looks like is absolutely needed within our industry. I think in a kind of sub-Saharan African context, what's needed, though, is actually some room for maneuver and some wiggle room in that to allow for sort of local context and, kind of difference again across regions, I guess, is that, it's not going to be one size fits all, and what works for a mine in Canada isn't going to work for a mine in Rwanda, for example. And I see this specifically around sort of standards around land acquisition and physical and economic resettlement. That's where I really see sort of these kind of cultural differences come out, and the way that people, that project affected people want to go about these, really high risk activities. So, we do need standards, but they need to be kind of sufficiently sort of allow for that room for maneuver, essentially. I think it's, you know, that's really, really, really important. And I think for TechMet, you know, what we think is really important is, you know, you have an idea of what good looks like, and we want to see all of our assets, you know, moving towards that. But it's not something that we need to see from sort of day, you know, from day dot. And certainly for sort of early stage companies and more junior companies, you know, what actually they really need is patient investors and capital. You know, we can't expect these early stage companies just to, you know, be aligned with sort of best practice on day two, when they're potentially, you know, when they're in a process of raising money or they're in construction. So I think it's really about sort of patient long-term capital as well, to ensure that, you know, to ensure that best practice can be met, and it certainly can't be met on day two.
Yeah, and I should say, IRMA, of course, isn't the only show in town, as it were, in terms of other standards. Sarah, I can see you nodding, and perhaps as an independent observer, you could quickly summarize where you think the ICMM consolidated standards debate is going, and whether that gives you the extra wiggle room or gives companies the extra wiggle room.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, ESG and sustainability is not a question of compliance. Because as soon as we start saying that, it caps people. And actually what sustainability and ESG is all about is that opportunity. So especially within the African space, the prize on the table is how can we utilize that wealth that is in the ground as a catalyst for societal developments that ideally is independent of extracting whatever material it is from the ground. And when we do extract the material, if indeed we need to at all, how do we do it in a way that doesn't destroy the environment and actually opens the door for a much more fruitful future over the next few hundred years, or whatever it is that time horizon is? So the interesting thing about the world of standards is there's a forest of standards that are out there. ISO are busy writing new standards. And I think as a practitioner in this space, and as someone who's actually had to implement this stuff on the ground, as well as, of course, write them, it is an absolute nightmare. So this is where the underlying factor is that most sustainability and ESG is actually really simple in terms of what sits at the core of it, in terms of the principles. So the trick is, how do you make sure that you are delivering on the most fantastically positive future that delivers on that shared value between those different actors that are there around a particular asset? And how do you measure it so that you can show transparently that you are actually doing what you're saying you're doing? And that delivering on, so you've got your competence, you've got your integrity, saying I'm delivering on what I've said I'm going to do, and then you've got your benevolence, so you say I've got everybody's best interests in mind. Those are the three key pillars of trust. And ultimately, ESG and sustainability, really trust sits at the core of it. So I think, just to conclude and come back to your question, Richard, what the ICMM are doing is great. So they're trying to, in a way, not simplify what is out there, but make it easier for different companies to engage with it. There are other systems. I've already mentioned ISO. You've got things like Digby. You've got all kinds of different aspects that are out there. At the end of the day, it is about performance and what an organization is actually doing, not necessarily the stamp that they have against their name. But of course, having something like IRMA is great because it shows that level of respectability, perhaps, in terms of what someone's actually doing.
Thanks, Sarah. And Davidzo, I haven't forgotten, I'm going to come back to you, but Natasha, I'll go to you first now, because on the risk side, how much does this flag up for companies? You know, because we talk about, is it a must or a barrier? Basically, I think we've all agreed that it's a must to a greater or lesser degree. But do companies in advance get put off by the complexity of what they've got to do? I can remember lots of discussions at Anglo about DR Congo and how you would try and meet all the standards in a way that you were comfortable with. Is it something that you find people misjudge and get wrong, and then you go in afterwards? And if I may throw in the question, we have to talk about China a bit, as to whether that unbalances the field.
Great question, and a really good question to come after Sarah's explanation of, you know, what is the point really of all of these frameworks? What is the intent, objectives of companies that are engaged in this space? Honestly, the companies that we work with are those that care. They've come to us because they are sophisticated players and they've allocated some resources to doing that upfront work, which already separates them in quite a large way from companies that actually don't have necessarily local communities in mind and beneficiaries, you know, in front of mind. There are a huge number of regulations and reporting frameworks that our clients have to adhere to. It is confusing. We see a breadth of attitudes from, I need to be covering every single data point, even though the EU regulatory framework for ESG is in a state of flux and it's not clear what data needs to be collected in all these different geographic locations and reported to whom. There are companies that are very cognizant. Typically, if they've got quite large in-house legal teams, then they're all over this, through to companies that simply have good intent. They don't want to do harm in their projects, and it comes from a place of ethics and values over, you know, reporting and regulatory compliance. And then there are people in between. And the sheer volume of frameworks makes it very difficult, very, very difficult to actually implement something that they feel in their heart is ethical. So a lot of what we do is due diligence in supply chains. And touching on the China point, a lot of that work is looking at supply chains that go back to China and looking at whether Uyghur forced labor has entered those supply chains. There are a variety of technical and non-technical ways that we might establish an exposure to forced labor, and that includes digging further down the supply chain beyond tier 1 and 2 to see if there are kind of bad actors, whether they are companies that have previously been exposed as working with Uyghur forced labor workers, are on sanctions lists, perhaps have a factory very near an internment camp, which might be a risk indicator. And of course, with the discovery of lithium in Tibet initially, and now in Xinjiang, which is Xinjiang Autonomous Region is home to the majority of Uyghur population, that prompts fears that Uyghur workers will then be drawn into that lithium supply chain, having discovered those reserves. So companies that engage us, I would say generally, are very mindful and cognizant that they absolutely cannot have human rights abuses going on in their supply chain, but they also know how difficult it is to get to the bottom of it. And it is a kind of best endeavors situation, really, because it's very, very difficult to get that accurately.
Thanks, Natasha. Davidzo, finally, on the ground in Africa, how does it feel? The question I'm trying to get at, I suppose, a bit is that we've talked about the clients wanting certain things, and we talked about the communities wanting certain things. What we haven't really talked about is what the governments want. I don't know if you feel competent to talk to that, but I suppose it's the question as to are the level of expectations in line? I mean, we talked about the EU strategy being one thing on critical minerals, and then the governments want beneficiation. How does that feel in line with your experience of implementing IRMA in Africa?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think the expectations of communities, of labor, and of governments do align with what the ESG standards are asking for. We have seen that as we have been implementing the IRMA standard, just to give you some statistics, 45% of the sites that are in the IRMA system are in Africa. That just gives you a sense of the participation and the value that African sites, mining sites, see in engaging in ESG standards. Also, there are also other realities that we need to take into account. So, for example, we look at Africa and the risks that Africa faces when it comes to financing, when it comes to accessing routes to market. Those are realities that African mining sites face. And how do they deal with those? How do they mitigate against those risks? One of the ways they do that is to engage, in ESG standards that provides, some sort of assurance to the purchasers, to the investors that, their practices are responsible. But what we have also seen, like Cecilia said, 90% of sites that come into the IRMA system, is mainly because of purchasers, but there's a shift in that. We have seen communities now going to mining sites and asking them to participate in, in the EMA, in the EMA system. The reason being that they've seen value in that. We've also seen how governments have also used, the EMA audit reports, for example. We have got a case in Zimbabwe where the Zimbabwe, Zela, which is an NGO in Zimbabwe, after the Unge mine audit, took the EMA audit report, and they used that for advocacy to review resettlement laws in the country. And they've also used that as a tool to lobby for some changes in the laws in Zimbabwe. So we actually see value in that. We see governments seeing value in the reports that we produce. We also see NGOs using the EMA audit reports for advocacy, for example, in the case of Zela. So in terms of aligning, yeah, definitely there's that alignment. And we've also seen communities coming to us asking how we can support them so that they can engage mining sites effectively. And we've developed tools that help communities so that they can engage mining sites quite more effectively. And I just want to touch on, EMA being a higher standard as well. Currently, we do not see, especially for Africa, the value in lowering the bar for mining sites. The reason being that already, decades of impacts in Africa, unmitigated risks, unmitigated harms have quite happened in Africa. And lowering the bar, what that would mean is to institutionalize harm. And that would open up, mining sites in Africa that already have peripheral risks to litigation, to conflicts with communities, lack of stability, and reputational harm, which not give them value, or there's no upside in lowering the bar. What we think is good value is provide support to the mining sites so that we encourage early adoption, for example, during exploration, start talking about ESG requirements at that point, but also acknowledging, the different levels where mining sites are, for example, and providing them with support. So how we provide support to mining sites at EMA is that we do have 3 dedicated mining leads that handhold sites if need be. And secondly, we also have tools that we provide, for example, self-assessment tools that mining sites can use to assess themselves to see where they are at, where the gaps exist, and then they use that, to continuously improve. And also the EMA system is not a pass-or-fail system. And that's also one of the challenges that we find with some of the ESG standards, that, the past judgment that, the site has failed or the site has passed. But I think there's need to acknowledge continuous improvement, acknowledge what the mine site is, and then they improve over time.
No, I think that's a really good point on Emma, is that it's, 50%, 75 and 100. And not many people get 100. I don't think anyone's got 100, do they? Perhaps Anglo-American did, almost.
Yeah,
Anyway.
There's also EMA transparency as well. That's the beginning. There's also EMA transparency. That's the beginning.
Yes, I should give a plug for the EITI as well in this space. Having been on the board of the EITI for the last 6 years, and a lot of their member countries are in Africa as well, because this is a further opportunity to get the full data out there in terms of, obviously it's primarily a governance element in terms of tax paid and tax received, as it were, but it's also quite a good insight into some of the wider sort of socio-political issues. Okay, so where to now? What I should say is that there is a chat function, and if people in the audience want to get a point registered, please use that, and I'll try and keep half an eye on it. I'd like to go back, I think, to Laura quickly. Laura, in terms of, I think we're all agreed that ESG matters, that the standards matter, and that they add value, and it is an opportunity. Do, in your experience, investors see it that way?
Thanks, Richard. Yes, absolutely is the short answer to that. What we're trying to do all the time is sort of de-risk projects, essentially allow all of our assets to get, alternative funding. Although we are a long-term patient investor ourselves. We want our assets to get more funding and to bring more investors on board. So we do absolutely see it as crucial. I think we also sort of recognize our role a little bit, that we can, certainly with some of our early stage assets, can be a little bit more sort of didactic, I guess, that we can ask for a lot more, and we do try and push them. We recognize the importance of it. We have investors ourselves that have incredibly high standards of us and therefore our assets. So, we see this as, what we're trying to do is build bankable projects, and we're all about bankability. And that's, we are just trying to de-risk these projects to ensure that they can be sustainable and, and that they can reach their potential and deliver value for all stakeholders. So absolutely it is something that, we look for. And what we're actually looking for, I think, is a commitment from management of that company that we're looking at, and that's really important. And it's actually something that you can tell pretty early on in some pretty early stage conversations. But if we have a CEO or a senior management team that really see ESG and good ESG management as integral to their success, then we're pretty happy, because I think it comes back to what Sarah was talking about, trust, and that goes between sort of an investor and an investee company. Being able to have that trust, in that company, that they see it as a real priority as well, that it's not just kind of like a nice to have, that they'll kind of mainstream ESG and E&S risk management in everything they do. Is really, really important for us, and ensuring, I guess, as well, that, there's no sort of absolute sort of really complex ESG issues that, are going to take a lot of time and a lot of capital to solve. But it, to go back to your original question, Richard, absolutely, it is of crucial importance to us to, as an investor, also of crucial importance to our investors ourselves. And it's just, in 2025, it is a bit of a non-negotiable, I think, as well, because of the increased scrutiny on sort of critical raw materials at the moment. I think, scrutiny on our industry has never really been higher. And so I think it's, it's definitely a challenge we're all kind of willing to rise to.
Yeah, what about, and anybody can answer this, the sort of ESG backlash that you see in the States under Trump and things? Is that, I mean, on the other hand, you then hear what IRMA is saying, everything is heading in a positive progression. And then you hear from the London Metals Exchange, they're beginning to see a chance for a premium on products that have been responsibly sourced. I think I've said enough to tee it up. I've got Cecilia and Sarah offering an answer. Who wants to go first?
Sarah,
Cecilia,
you raised your analogic hand first,
you
so please go.
put your yellow hand up, so I suppose technically get the right to go first.
Oh, thank you very much, Cecilia. That's very kind of you. So I think firstly, so yes, we are seeing a removal of the term ESG quite a lot at the moment. But actually, again, ESG isn't about a compliance thing. It's actually it increases your chance of success just by doing it properly. There are lots of fantastic papers that are out there showing that of 1,000 exploration projects, only one will actually manifest itself as an operating mine, 1 in 1,000. Now, that either says that your exploration companies out there are terrible, or it means that we're not, or traditionally we haven't been rolling in the right areas of potential threat and opportunity, i.e. our risks. Now, if I could have a penny or a cent or whatever for every exploration company that said to me, oh, we're too early for ESG, then I would be a very rich individual. And speaking as somebody who started as an exploration geologist, you are never too early for ESG and sustainability. And in fact, alongside the potentially being the right rock in the ground and that financial demand for that rock, the third aspect that you have to have a handle on are all those aspects of sustainability. So that's a case there where that initial underlying understanding and actually respect for what's going on or potentially going on within a society or within the environment is just as important as there potentially being some rocks within the ground. So what does this mean with regards to what's happening in the US right now? So fine, we might not have that government level of support that maybe we've had historically from the US, But it takes on average 17 years for an exploration project to result in a mine. And unless something very strange happens to the American way of doing things, Mr. Trump's not going to be around for the next 17 years in that position of power. So I think that it's actually a really good opportunity for us to reflect on what are those rules or those guidelines, and making sure we're focusing in on things that are practical and pragmatic rather than ticking boxes. There's no point in writing a piece of paper. It's about what somebody's actually doing. That's what we need to be measuring and encouraging. So it's behavior rather than tick boxing. What do you
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, Cecilia.
Yeah, I would actually like to bring in the point of view of the buyers that are in IRMA. So the buyers are the purchasing companies. There are over 30 companies today in IRMA. So that's 10 car makers from VW to, well, Mercedes, Tesla, etc., but also tech companies like Google, Microsoft, HP, renewable energy, and jewelry, right? So very diverse pool, I would say. Now, because of this rollback in legislation, so I'm thinking about the EU and the due diligence laws, etc., what they're turning to us and saying, okay, now robust voluntary standards are even more important for us to rely on, because we no longer have that certainty that regulation gives us. So they rely more on IRMA. One very clear message that we get is they will navigate this period of uncertainty, but staying on track, exactly how Sarah said. I mean, this isn't going to last forever, right? So staying on track with their engagement with their suppliers, what they're asking of them, etc. And we're seeing the exact same thing from investors, but actually investors bring in a different point of view. They're afraid of litigation, because litigation right now, if anything, it's going to be exacerbated. NGOs are going to look at things like even more closely. And we hosted a roundtable for investors a couple of weeks ago in London, and one of them said, I don't want to see any letters on my desk coming from NGOs. That's my worst nightmare. So how do you decrease the risk? By really, putting in place those robust standards from the offset, including in exploration. I think, what Davidzo said, it's progressive. Nobody's asking you to pass or fail, because it is not pass or fail, but it's really starting to put those practices in early so that you don't have a shock 5 years down the road, realizing that you've never done a single meeting of community engagement or whatnot.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, relationships with NGOs. We haven't got a nice direct NGO rep here, but my view was always that if you do get a letter from an NGO, it shouldn't be a surprise. You should be talking to them in the first place a bit. Sarah.
Yeah, and I think actually, to be honest, undertaking broad engagement, especially with people who don't necessarily agree with what you're doing on, kind of on the surface of it, is really good, because it makes you consider what you're doing or what you're thinking of doing from a different angle. And so therefore, and this could be absolutely anything. So say you are designing a mine, the more co-creation that you have going into that, the better, because you'll then be able to say, well, where are those areas of opportunity? The purpose of a mine isn't just to extract material out the ground and then to close it. And in fact, I have a really big problem with the term closure, because that patch of land is moving through time. So what are you actually aiming for afterwards? And that might not be the job of, certainly not the job of an exploration company, because an exploration company doesn't want to dig anything out of the ground. They want to sell their project to a mining company. The mining company then wants to dig material out of the ground. But in terms of that societal development, etc., the mining company might not be the expert to do that. So what's that ecosystem of organizations and people, etc., that ideally need to be catalyzed by the presence of that rock? So I think that it's very interesting, and it's great if you get people disagreeing with one another, because it means you've got more people sharing their thoughts, their perceptions, that then can result in a much more robust plan and hopefully activity that will really help that area.
That's a perfect link to a question. I'm proud of myself. I've been following the Q&A, and someone has asked anonymously, how do we find the right time and the right approach to wedge the principles of sustainability in a way that will work, i.e. the challenges? Essentially, what you're describing, what have been describing, is time consuming. The more people you talk to, the more time it can take. And certainly I can remember projects where that was the case. By listening, you actually put off your implementation times. How does that work in people's minds? Natasha, you haven't had a go recently. How do you think about that?
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about the responses and your question around US approach at the moment to ESG, DEI. And actually what I'm seeing is that the cut in funding for international development has led to an increase in the private sector to see how they can kind of plug that finance gap. And of course, it has to align with commercial objectives. But I do see that rather than ESG and international development being seen as a compliance function or even a risk mitigation tool, it's actually being seen as an opportunity to have a positive impact and to, have a return on a particular project. So I think there's more onus on the private sector and more input coming from the private sector on this, which is a really interesting development, and hopefully it will continue. But how do you begin? How do you allocate resources, especially when it can be difficult to do that? It's just one of these. I think it's one of these situations where, and I am going to refer to a technical part of an EU regulatory framework with the CSRD, but double materiality assessments are actually a very useful tool, even in an abstract way, to understand, okay, what are the risks facing my organization in carrying out a particular project or going into a particular market, and what am I contributing to? What am I making worse and having a negative impact on? And where can I shift my business decisions to turn that into a more positive impact? And I think that's a brilliant starting point, so that we're not looking at ESG and impact as something alongside business strategic decisions, but we're embedding it in business strategic decisions. And that's where that sort of a tool becomes very helpful to make those decisions from the outset. And that dictates how you go about a project, how you go about allocating time and resources to embed sustainability and positive impact into a particular project. But no, there really is no clear answer or one size fits all. And we find that companies begin light, to be honest. Very few go all in at the beginning and build up how much due diligence they might do, how much forward planning they might do. It's rare that you will have someone that has every single exact right consultant or partner from the beginning. But what I've seen more and more is time being spent considering stakeholder engagement, which it is a great thing and has built up over time. There's been a lot of literature, a lot of pressure from NGOs to speak to communities, to speak to stakeholders. And there are lots of established mechanisms for doing that now. So I think a combination of that materiality, double materiality, risk, embedding it in decisions, and stakeholder engagement are the two things that we recommend doing from the outset.
Great, thank you. I'm keeping half. Laura, do you want to come in? I'm then going to come back to a question on diamonds, but Laura, come in on that.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I'm just going to kind of draw attention to quite a nice example of sort of, what might be needed to kind of close this gap. And I'm very much of the belief that there is a kind of capital vacuum for early stage companies when it comes to ESG. We're very much about proportionality, but in any case, I think, there's a real need for kind of specialized vehicles in this case. And a nice example is that, one of our portfolio companies has recently received a ESG focused technical assistant grant from the DFC, so the Development Finance Corporation of the US government, specifically for ESG work streams. So this is a sort of multi-year grant of $3 million, cost shared with the company, to spend on all sorts of things, such as reviewing their ESHAs, doing some river rehabilitation work, increased community engagement, and community investment projects. And what this will allow the company to do is really sort of prioritize ESG at a stage of the company where it is capital constrained, and there is the company has an awful lot of projects that it could be assigning capital to. So that really ensures that ESG is really prioritized as this company develops and gets it to a stage where it then can attract government funding and sovereign funding and even potential sort of PE funding as well. So so it's those types of specialized vehicles, which, very specific to our industry, but that type of funding is, invaluable to a company of that size and at that stage. So, there's, and to their credit, the DFC have really recognised potential in that project and really recognised what the issues are and where it needs, where it might need some assistance, and that is kind of a game changer for that particular company.
And is the sum of money enough? Because that was always the question that the DFC were saying, "Oh, we'll help you," but actually the amount they'll invest compared to what
it's that,
China will invest in.
Over the course of about 24 months that this grant's going to be administered for, it's a significant amount of money. It's cost shared with the company, so there's there's that to think about as well. But there's no doubt that this is filling a vacuum that nobody else could have come in and filled at this stage. So absolutely, it is enough, and there's no one else that could have that that sort of vehicle. So no, that's a reason to not be too pessimistic, perhaps.
No, that's because one hears so much about the cutback in aid and therefore assumes that it's difficult. But it's encouraging. I'm finding this conversation quite encouraging, actually. Davidzo, your hand was up. Can I just throw in thank you to colleagues who've been answering questions that appear in the Q&A. That's a massive help. But the one I had picked up on was the declining diamond prices, which effectively takes us to Botswana and Namibia in a way, and Zimbabwe, I suppose, DRC perhaps a bit, but certainly does, and you've probably seen the question, can you leverage it to reposition natural diamonds as a premium purpose-driven product in global markets? I mean, I'm mindful of my former colleagues in De Beers in my ears saying, yes, of course. But Davidzo, I don't know if you had much exposure to diamonds in IRMA work, or previously, but please feel free to either pick up something else or answer that.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that and then, talk about the cyclical nature of commodities. I think that's a reality and the impact that has on, the capital that mines have. And one of the things that might happen is that during, cyclical downturns, you then see ESG budgets being cut, reduction in stakeholder engagement, for example, reduction in the audits that, will be done within that cycle. For example, those are realities. I also just want to pick up on, funding for ESG that Laura's, talking about. And the reality that we also face, or the questions that we also get as IRMA in terms of funding for audit projects, for example. These are realities that we face. And one of the things that we have designed is that we are currently piloting a cohort model. A cohort model is, mine size, small mine size, for example, junior mines in the same area, say, for example, if it's junior mines in South Africa, then the audit is done at the same time. We have seen that marginally reduces the cost of audits, and it also encourages junior mines to, take up audits, because now the cost of audits will not be a barrier. And we're also piloting an academy that houses, resources or tools that can help mining companies, including junior mining companies, on responsible mining. We see that is providing value to junior miners, especially because they might not have resources, and especially during times where they're facing cyclical downturns, where they may not be able to engage consultants because it's costly to do so. So most of the work has to be done in-house. In such cases, then there is potential, or there is opportunities for them to continue implementing ESG requirements. But how do they do that? What support do they get so that they do not drop the ball? For example, with what's happening with cobalt, I'm thinking of DRC, and also diamonds. I'm thinking of Botswana, for example, that sites do not drop the ball when, there are cyclical downturns, but what support do they get? Say, for example, from standard setting organizations. How do standard setting organizations innovate so that they're able to provide value to mining sites, especially juniors, so that they can continue implementing ESG requirements even in times where they're facing financial difficulties?
Yeah, no, that's really encouraging as well. On diamonds, specifically, you've got this, whether it's a cyclical downturn or not, you've got this division now between synthetic or lab-grown diamonds, as they call them, versus natural ones. And I was always struck by the way in which De Beers marketed or helped market natural diamonds as something that helped preserve biodiversity and wealth in poor countries. And I suppose that then becomes a branding question as to whether the customer is willingly paying for that. And presumably that takes us back to the area too of the premium that you're looking for in either in precious, something like diamonds, or in critical minerals, whereby responsible copper, they've got all these schemes out there. It's not clear to me yet that there is a premium per se, but certainly something like copper, for which there's projected to be such a shortfall by 2030, that you think there must be opportunity for that to happen. Anybody want to chip in on that as to the sort of the opportunity and capitalizing on future value in a way that's going to be helpful to African countries? Sarah, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is, if we can crack that challenge, which is, how do you see that natural resource in the ground as the opportunity rather than as a resource curse? And so therefore, if there are beautiful natural diamonds sitting there in the ground, if you can work out how that can be used as a catalyst for societal development in a positive manner, then if you shift across to synthetic diamonds, you are, well, yes, you're leaving that opportunity still in the ground, which might be a good thing, but it means that you are not leveraging that natural resource, which is a shame, because you're not leaning into it. However, you have to be able to do it right. And so this is where, and I've been putting into the Q&A a little bit, you can never be too early for ESG. And actually all of the resource reserve governance codes and guidelines have been updated over the last few years. So JORC is still in the process of being updated from Australia, but it was actually SAMREC from Southern Africa that was the first resource reserve code to do this. So the best place to embed ESG and sustainability is within that resource reserve statement that says, I think I actually have something in the ground, which you then take to investors and they go, oh, great, yes, I will provide you with some funds so that we might be able to extract it. Now, if we go back 5 years, ESG has always really, it's been a modifying factor. Nobody really knew how to do it. And so what's been happening there is really entrenched in that core governance that you cannot do anything without, really, especially if you need investment to do it, is entrenching ESG in a meaningful manner within those codes there. So I think there are things here where if we really can embed that opportunity with regards to what those natural resources can bring to a region, that then has the greatest long-term value, but it needs to be weighed up against all the other aspects. And I know there are a number of other questions talking about supply chain, which Natasha knows an awful lot more about than I do. But the key thing here is that risk is not just about trying to stop threat from happening. The official definition for risk is the effect of uncertainty on our objectives. And those uncertainties are often both positive and negative. And so what you're doing with this risk management is balancing those positives and negatives, and also acknowledging that something that might be an opportunity for me might be a threat to somebody else. So everything happening in a network. And so what you're trying to do here through things like double materiality assessments is understand what is everybody's different perspectives. If you change one thing, how does it change it for everybody else? And how can you optimize that patch of land as it moves through time and space, not just for you, but especially for those people who actually call it home.
Yeah, no, that's a very helpful setting out. In terms of where risk assessment takes us, one tends to think, having done quite a lot of risk work, that Africa always scores quite highly because of all the various bits of uncertainty. So it's interesting to hear you describe uncertainty as potentially positive. But I mean, that's the kind of mindset I suppose we need to get into a bit. Does anybody want to pick up on the sort of I mean, certainly which countries are kind of doing well in this space. Botswana was clearly an example on the diamond side. Zambia felt like one that was going in the positive direction, certainly espousing good ESG practice. And yet, when I went to the Zambia mining thing last year, they were looking over their shoulders at DRCs. I mean, Zambia was doing 800,000 tons of copper or something at most, or 600 to 800, and DRC was taking off to about 2 million tons. So they were sort of saying, well, what is the DRC doing right that we're not doing? And the answer probably was Chinese investment. But not uniquely. You had the Ivanhoe mines, Kamark, Kula, and things. So there were plenty of actual collaborative works in DRC. I suppose DRC's got the better rocks. The problem perhaps there is that people are unrealistic about their potential. You have to sort of accept that the rocks dominate to an extent.
Well, the one thing that you cannot change are the rocks. So if there isn't any copper or cobalt in the ground or diamonds or whatever, no matter how much wishing, it's not going to be created, at least certainly not within our lifetimes.
You've frozen on me. Have you frozen on anybody else? Or have I frozen?
Research and innovation comes in, because what was a very good resource a number of years ago actually
is it just me, or is it Sarah's breaking up a bit?
It's Sarah, Richard.
Yeah, sorry, Sarah, we're going to switch over to Cecilia, if I may. Cecilia, we talked about policies coming from Southern Africa or Africa. What about policies coming from client states, as it were? We touched a bit on the EU and their kind of framing of things from their perspective. Is that helpful?
Yeah. So let me give you a great example that I worked a lot on. It's the European Battery Regulation. So it's a law that for the first time governs the life cycle of a product and includes specific due diligence provisions on human rights and environment protection for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite supply chains. So asking economic operators, car makers, battery makers, etc., to conduct due diligence all the way to the mine site. Now, at IRMA, in turn, so let me bring it to our world and to this conversation, we've seen massive uptake, so much so that over 40% of the world's lithium has been assessed against the IRMA standard. 30% of Indonesian's nickel is being assessed. I mentioned earlier that graphite mine, which is the largest one outside China. And we recently just announced the CMAG TFM mine in the DRC. So that's a cobalt mine, right? So it clearly shows that when there is that perfect regulatory pressure and that ambition to ask not just social, right, human rights due diligence, but also environmental due diligence, it's, customers can work with their suppliers to better understand and ask for transparency, because that's also what this is about. The regulation gives the automakers or the battery makers that power to start looking at their supply chains, right? And asking those questions. And in turn, that drives greater traceability. So because of that, also at IRMA, we've developed a chain of custody standard, which basically it's not the technology really that governs, blockchain and whatnot, but it's what are you allowed to claim and how are you allowed to claim it? And it goes back to the diamond discussion a little bit, right? If BMW wants to claim that 100% of their lithium comes from mines that have been assessed against the IRMA standard, because the audits are so transparent, the audit results are transparent, they're actually able to claim this is the exact impact that our lithium has on communities or on water or different things. Because, and then you create that, that perfect scenario where you have traceability, you've got transparency, and you're actually talking about the impacts without shying away. And as a buyer, you can make claims about it.
Thanks, Cecilia. And Sarah, thanks for answering. I think you're answering the question on tailings. We've seen as a final question coming. We're running out of time, but I'll quickly pick up on this one. How can we rely on ensuring learnings are really built into how we can prevent potential issues altogether? I think we've kind of answered that, haven't we, Cecilia, in IRMA language anyway, that effectively and Laura, you picked up on this too, that people are embedding this in an earlier stage, so that actually it isn't something along the side adjacent, it's something that's integral to the way the mine's going to work. I think that is the answer to that.
Yeah.
Go,
Cecilia. If
yeah.
I just may for a moment, Richard. So for example, if I look back at some of our early audits in Chile, we have an open grievance mechanism. Everybody can see both the grievances and also the responses from IRMA and the auditors, etc. And those first grievances were about how the auditors interpreted certain requirements in the IRMA standard and how the sites were assessed. That is amazing feedback that we received because we were able to go back and train the auditors, produce some excellent guidelines. We have an excellent guideline of FPIC. If any of you in the audience are interested in understanding better how to actually operationalize free, prior, and informed consent. So I think, the point being that this is really a learning process. It's an iterative process. It cannot be one point in time, which is also why philosophically IRMA doesn't talk about certification, but it's rather an assessment against the standard, right?
That's really helpful. Right, we've got 3 minutes left. I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds to say where they come out on the balance of this. My reading of it is that it's must and barrier are helpful words to set up the antithesis, but actually driving towards it as an opportunity for all parties, I think it seems to be the right phrase to be using. So that's where I'd come out on this. Suffice to say that if I don't get the chance to say it again, everybody who's been attending, thank you for coming, and please look at the CMAG website for future events, and please also consider joining. Okay, who wants to go next? Natasha, would you go from the other way this time on my screen?
Sure.
Positive feelings about this general, not discussion per se, but the situation on the ground?
Very positive. It feels at the moment like, although we're in another kind of minerals race, it feels very different actually to the times that have come before, where we're really thinking about stakeholders, we're really thinking about beneficiaries, and we're really doing it in a transparent way. And transparency has been mentioned a few times on the webinar. I think you cannot tackle, focus, mitigate anything that you don't know exists. So the data sharing, the conversations that are happening are all very, very positive in shining a light on what we need to think about and what risks exist.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, for some reason, Laura, you've cropped up next on the right of my screen.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Yeah, completely. ESG is obviously an absolute must, but what is needed is time, capital, and proportionality.
Brilliant, thank you. Davidzo.
Yeah, I think what I get is that there's need to support African mines to engage in ESG standards. It's not about them engaging in ESG standards, the support they are getting to engage in ESG standards that is important.
Thank you. Lovely. Sarah?
Yeah, ESG is an opportunity. So let's see it being taken and optimizing those rocks that we can only dig out of the ground once. So let's do it in the best possible way that gives all of society and the environment the best possible outcomes.
Thank you very much. Well, I think judging from comments on the Q&A and from me, you've been a wonderful panel. Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion. And let's hope we see more of this through the CMAG route. And anybody wanting further information, certainly either go through the website or contact Ronnie or Olympia. Okay, thank you all.